Welcome. I'm Carole Harmon, and you are listening to Writers Radio. Author Maria Coffey grew up in an Irish Catholic family with a mother who wished nothing more than to be a grandmother. Instead, Maria was introduced to the world of high-risk adventure by her older brother, who climbed mountains. She fell in love with the famous climber, Joe Tasker, who died on Everest. This was a turning point of her life. She began to write. Maria joins me today to discuss and read from her new release, Instead, Navigating the Adventures of a Child-Free Life, a memoir. Maria has traveled the world by kayak, bicycle, and on foot with her husband, Dag Goering, a veterinarian and photographer. They run an award-winning adventure travel company called Hidden Places. Maria and Dag still explore the world together, scout and create new trips, and fund conservation work, such as their project, Elephant Earth. Maria's books explore the hidden facets of extreme sport, topics rarely discussed and almost never spoken of in public. We begin with Maria reading from Instead.
Under a dawn-blushed sky, we paddled hard for Puerto Escondido. After half an hour, the wind came up. The waves started building again, but we knew we could make it. "How you feeling?" Doug called from the back cockpit. "Ready for a big meal," I called back, "and a long shower." "Really?" he said. "I'm sad the trip is over. I can't wait to be out in even wilder places for much longer. And I've been thinking..." He paused. "I've been thinking that we could easily have a baby along on a trip like this." I stopped paddling. I swung around to face him. "A baby? Why not?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Oh, just a few things like baking heat, no shade, sandstorms," I retorted. "Not to mention running out of food and water." "No problem," he replied cheerfully. "You could breastfeed it. And anyway, babies are tougher than you think." "Have you lost your fucking mind?" I shouted as a wave sloshed over my deck. "How could we risk having a baby along in these conditions? What if we capsized? What about all the stuff babies need?" "What stuff?" he said. I flashed on a memory of watching friends with a baby pack for a weekend away. Diapers, wipes, creams for skin rash, talcum powder, baby food, change mats, sterilizing stuff, clothes, toys, those spit cloth things. "We wouldn't need any of that shit," he interrupted. "We'd do it differently, more naturally." "Oh, would we?" I shouted. And on it went. Despite paddling hard against the building wind, we managed to argue the rest of the way. As we pulled into protected waters, I called a truce. I didn't want to think or talk about babies. I wanted to eat.
As you continue to discuss the possibility of having a child with your husband, Dag, you always imagined that you would have to give up an adventuresome life, and he imagined that you would be able to take a child with you into an adventuresome life. Do you now think that there's a middle ground in terms of safety when raising children?
Oh, yes, I think there definitely is. And we have friends who have done very adventurous things with their children. Some of which I would not do. But I think the thing is, the adventures that we wanted to have, the adventures that we did have, there's no way that I could have brought a child along in those. That's the realization he came to as well.
Yeah.
That we would have to temper
what we wanted to do if there was going to be a baby on board.
How did your experiences in other cultures alter your view of child rearing?
That's a very interesting question. I guess in my 20s and 30s, I'd sort of seen motherhood as a real kind of encumbrance,
Yes.
I'd see these, all my friends, I go to visit them and their house would be full of baby strollers and nappies and stuff. Then when we traveled in different parts of the world, it all seemed a lot simpler. But of course, that was because people didn't have money. I'm sure they would have loved to have had strollers and diapers. But I think it did kind of open me up to the idea of motherhood as something very lovely, which up to that point, I hadn't felt like that at all.
From India, we flew to Malawi and set off to kayak the eastern side of the third largest lake in Africa. Along those 600 kilometers, there were no large towns, only small villages and farms. The water was warm, potable, and teeming with fish. It was also home to crocodiles, hippos, and lake flies that hatched in the millions under the surface and rose up in dense, choking clouds. Because the lake was the size of an inland sea, it was often beset by strong winds, storms, big waves, and waterspouts. The fishers we met at our first night's campsite thought we were crazy. You go all the way in that boat? No engine, only paddling? You like death? They couldn't understand why we would seek out such danger. For them, daily life was dangerous. The country was in the grip of a repressive regime guilty of appalling human rights violations. Prisons were full of political detainees. There was a network of spies, informers, and paramilitary that had everyone on edge, even in the smallest settlements. One of the worst droughts for decades was underway, causing crops to fail. People were going hungry. About a quarter of the population had AIDS, which was referred to as Slim's disease. You catch it, lose a lot of weight quickly, and then die. And we constantly heard stories of deaths caused by hippo and crocodile attacks and the tiny malarial mosquito. Almost every beach we camped on had a village close by. We would seek out the headman, ask permission to stay the night, and give gifts of fishing lures and line and carving equipment, which were always accepted with sheer amazement. We'd pitch our tent on soft sand beneath baobab trees. By dawn next morning, there would already be women and children waiting for us, watching as we made pancakes with flour and milk powder. Muzungu, the children would whisper, white people. Muzungu food. The staple diet here was maize or cassava flour mixed with water to form a bland paste called nsima. Salt was rarely added. Few could afford it. Sometimes the nsima was eaten with relish made from tiny fish boiled into a mush. The children asked us for everything. Discarded tea bags, empty tins, the soup packet from last night's dinner, our clothes, our sunglasses, our watches, soap, flour, sugar, salt, and medicine. Soon we were eking out our medical kit as Doug treated the people who came to us with suppurating cuts, septic wounds, burns. Those telling us they had headache, gonorrhea, or stomachache, we had to turn away. Early one morning, on the beach close to the village of Sanjay, a woman walked past our tent on her way to collect water in the lake. We'd met her briefly the day before, and on learning we had the same name, she had laughed in delight. But now she was somber. She whispered that a baby had died in the night. "Come with me," said Maria. Outside the house of the bereaved family, a group of women sat singing hymns and swaying from side to side. From inside came the low, insistent wailing of the mother as she grieved over the body of her dead infant. He was her 7th child, Maria told me, and the 3rd she'd lost to malaria. Later, the family would bury him with his siblings in the shade of a giant baobab tree. I was speechless. I felt desperately sorry for the woman in the house, for Maria, for all her neighbours. They couldn't stop having babies. They couldn't stop them from dying. They were trapped by poverty. This village was the start and end of their lives. Then Maria leaned over and asked me how many children I had. No children, I said. Oh, she gasped, her face clouding with renewed sadness. I am so sorry for you.
Would you speak about Vin and Bak a little?
Dag and I had many discussions about, he wanted children when we first met. And so we had a lot of discussion about this and eventually came to an agreement that, you know, he's in the end, he saw things my way, that we couldn't have children and pursue this kind of the adventures that we wanted. And then I was, how old? I guess I was 45 by this time. So the decision was kind of over anyway. We went to Vietnam just after it opened up to tourism in 1994 and spent 3 months traveling up the coast on local boats and on bikes, rickety old bikes. And at the end of that trip, we ended up in Halong Bay. And there we met a couple of street children. Vin was about 11 or 12. His little sister was probably about 5. They were living on the street. Their mother had died when Bak was very small, and their father was blind. And father lived in the Red River Delta in a squatter settlement, and these children were sent out to Halong Bay. They would sing and on buses and collect money. And there were these 2 dusty, sweet children who we encountered and quickly developed a relationship with. In my case, when I met Bak, it was like love at first sight.
In Bai Chai, Sunny called out to local people asking about Vin Mot Chan. We soon found him outside the bus station. He greeted us with a delighted grin. When we sat down with him at a food stall, about 15 other street children gathered around us, laughing excitedly and teasing Vin. He handed his can of Festi Cola to the boy next to him, and soon it was being passed around, each child taking a tiny sip. Meanwhile, Sunny quietly asked him questions. Vin sleeps here with the other kids, he said, pointing to the space between the row of food stalls and the brick wall enclosing the bus station. He says in the summer it is okay, but in the winter they have to find cardboard and paper to keep warm. Vin put his hand on Sunny's knee and added something. He says he has a big brother and a little sister here. The sister sings too. He wants Maria to meet her. Vin led us to a parked bus. It was packed with people, some struggling to get on board while others were trying to get off. Dag and Sunny started taking photographs of the equally confused scene on the roof as sacks of rice, live pigs, roosters, and crates of ducks were passed up and down. Vin nimbly climbed on board, indicating I should follow. I was on the top step when a tiny girl appeared, wiggling through the bodies, singing in a high, breathy voice and holding out a hat for money. Tousled dark hair fell into her eyes and framed a sweet, heart-shaped face. Her long, loose pants and flower-patterned blouse were dusty. Her feet were bare. Around her neck hung a pink cloth bag, roughly stitched with brown thread. Vin lunged forward to grab her. She looked bewildered as the three of us backed down the steps and stood on the gravel. "Name back," Vin told me, hugging her. I squatted down so we were eye to eye. "Name Maria," I said, pointing to myself. "Maria," she repeated slowly. "Maria." Holding my gaze, she fished around in the pink bag, pulled out a dirty plastic comb and dragged it through her hair. How can you explain love at first sight? I'd met and hung out with countless children during our 3-month journey up the coast of Vietnam. The kids of the families who took us across the Mekong Delta aboard their cargo boats. The children who always appeared from nowhere when we stopped at roadside cafes during our endless ride along Highway 1, mistaking the tan on my legs for dirt and trying to rub it away. And in any tourist place where the street children tried to sell us postcards and chewing gum. When I'd first met Vin, once I got past the idea he could be a thief, I was drawn to his special qualities. He was self-contained, measured and proud, aware of but not cowed by his circumstances. What I felt on meeting back was completely different. Friends of mine had described the love rush they experienced after giving birth to a baby. Yet there was nothing hormonal to explain why, when I stood up and back slipped her hand into mine, I was besotted with all my protective instincts suddenly roused.
We spent some days with them. We went out with them on a boat in Halong Bay. We'd made a Vietnamese friend there who lived for quite a long time in the States and had just come back to Vietnam. We were talking to him about how we could help these children, if we could get them into a school, get them off the street somewhere. Doug suggested the SOS Children's Village. There was one in Hanoi. There was one being built in Haiphong. So we went to the Red River Delta to meet their father, who agreed that he would allow them to go off the streets and move into the SOS Children's Village, where they would be safe and they'd live there, they'd get an education. We thought we had everything set up, but it kind of broke my heart when we left to go back to Canada, saying goodbye to them. But things became quite complicated quite quickly. The SOS Children's Village agreed to take them, even though they didn't usually take street children. They have to follow strict rules. But they agreed that they would take Vin and Back, and they agreed that Back particularly was at risk because she could be sold into prostitution quite young. That was happening quite a bit then on the Chinese border. Even girls that young were sold as virgins. But when we were discussing this with them, the head of the village said to us, "I just want you to know that if you were thinking of adoption, it wouldn't be possible because the children still have a parent, and also the Vietnamese government does not approve of foreign adoptions." We were very excited about them going to the SOS Children's Village. The following year, we went back there to get it all arranged and arrived at their village with some of the top people from the SOS Children's Village who'd been going to see the father. He'd said that he wanted them to go to the Haiphong village, which was near to where he lived, and that was only just about to open. So we arrived at the village really excited, thinking that we'd see Vin and Back. Their father was there. The children weren't there. And with their father was a woman that we hadn't met before, and the people from the SOS Children's Village hadn't met before. And she claimed to be his new wife, and she also claimed to have a new baby. And she said quite categorically through our interpreters that the children could not go to the school unless we paid money to cover the earnings that they made. And that was totally against the rules of the SOS Children's Village. They wouldn't use children as a bargaining chip. Their little house was shut tight, and I'm still haunted to this day, because she said the children were out begging and that they'd taken the baby with them to beg. I'm still haunted by the thought that they might have been inside that house with the door shut. We kept trying for 2 more years, but the father and the stepmother just kept refusing. About 2 years later, the people at SOS Children's Village told me that they'd heard that the father had gone back up to the Chinese border. And I was devastated. I just immediately wanted to leave and go up to this place and find them. And they talked me out of it. They pointed out that even if I did find them, it would just make things worse. There was nothing that I could do. There was nothing that they could do. And that was the last we ever heard of back. It still really haunts me. It was so heartbreaking because they could have had a very different life if we'd been successful. And it taught me so much about the politics of poverty. It taught me that as a Westerner, you just can't expect to sweep in somewhere with a magic wand and make everything okay. Poverty is complicated, and it's complicated to help people. That was a hard lesson.
Your next experience, though, of helping a young woman in Africa had a happier ending.
It did. We have an adventure travel company, Hidden Places, and we were on a safari and doing some trekking in northern Kenya. My husband's a veterinarian with a big interest in elephants, and we were doing anti-poaching work up there. And we'd started working with a group of women in a village that elephants went through. It was kind of a route for them when they were moving around looking for food, and there was often human-elephant conflict. And we were trying to help improve the relationship between elephants and humans. They were collecting dung and they were making paper from the elephant dung, and then they were beading it in the traditional Samburu way, and then making cards, these beaded cards, and selling them to tourist lodges in the area. And we had agreed to fund the building of a workshop that was solely for them. And there was a school teacher in the village called Joseph, who's a very enlightened man, and he'd been our kind of go-to person with the women. You know, he would translate for us, and he really believed in women's independence. Their husbands didn't like the fact they were gaining some independence, and he was really on their side. He took us aside, took Dag and I aside, and told us that he had a star pupil, and she was very bright, and she'd been given a place at Nairobi University, which was a big thing for a girl from a very remote Samburu village. However, her father and the male elders of the village, had refused to give her any financial support she needed to go to university, because since the age of 12, she'd refused to undergo female circumcision, female genital mutilation, FGM. She'd made a stand against it, which was huge in that community. This was 2011. FGM had just been made illegal in Kenya, but it was still being practiced in remote communities and still is. But Agnes, since 12, had said no, she would not go through this. So he asked if we could help her by supporting her to go to university. So I asked him to bring her over to meet the group. I said, don't tell her why, just say we'd like to talk to somebody from the village who speaks good English and we can ask questions. So she came over and talked about different things about the village and her schooling and everything. And then at one point I said to her, so I believe that you have a place at Nairobi University. And she held her head high and she said, I do, but I cannot take it because I refuse to be cut. And it was, it was one of those moments, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. After we finished talking to her, we thanked her, and she went, back to our house, and we went into a huddle with Joseph. And there and then we had 12 guests on this trip. We decided we would make a pledge to raise the money between us to send her, to cover her costs to go to university. The big question that we had was, how is this going to affect her in the village? How is this going to affect her relationship with her father and her mother? And it turned out that her mother, Mary, was totally in support of this. Her father was rather abusive, alcoholic at that point. Mary was basically prepared to stand up to him and support her daughter to go to university. So our group supported her for 3 years. Then she decided she wanted to be a barrister. Doug and I took over helping her. And long story short, she is now a barrister in Nairobi. She is the mother of 2 children. She's a single mother. She's doing all sorts of legal work, but some of it is voluntary, supporting women and children in her community, particularly finding ways to combat FGM and to bring other ways of celebrating women's passage into womanhood without such a barbaric practice.
Christmas Day, 2020. I was on WhatsApp in a long text conversation with Agnes. I'd just broken the news that we had to postpone the fundraising trek in Laikipia we had planned for the following February. Agnes and her son Adrian were to be our special guests, and it was to be a very special trip, walking across their homelands, arriving in the village where I met Agnes, being greeted by her mother and the other women of the paper-making cooperative, singing and celebrating with them. But the ongoing problem of COVID-19, not to mention Dag's accident, had scuppered that dream. Agnes had been sending me photos of Adrian's birthday party. Earlier in the month he turned 6. He looked grown up, wearing khaki long pants and a t-shirt with a surfing logo, his hair fashionably shaved at the temples. "We've been having conversations about you," she wrote. "He's always asking who you are. I told him you are my fairy godmother." "Oh, that is lovely," I replied. "I've been meaning to tell you I'm writing a book about my decision not to have children. I will be describing how children like you came into my life later on. And now I can say I'm a fairy godmother." There was a pause. Dots appeared and disappeared as she started to write something, then erased it. More dots, and finally the message. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. There is something I've been meaning to ask you, but I had been holding back until we met." "What is it?" I wrote. "I hope one day you will grant me permission to call you mother." This time the pause was on my end. I was stunned. Blinking back tears, I tapped out a quick reply. Of course she had my permission. It was an honor, a gift. "The heavens knew I would meet you," she wrote back. "You are full of love and care. I love you and always will do, Mama." Becoming a mother at 68 on WhatsApp on Christmas Day, it was something I could never have imagined. It was perfect.
You have been listening to Maria Coffey read from Instead, Navigating the Adventures of a Child-Free Life, a memoir, and in conversation with me, Carole Harmon. Instead was published in Canada in 2023 by Rocky Mountain Books. Visit hiddenplaces.net to learn of Maria and Dag's travel company and their conservation work. This program is also available as a podcast on the Writers Radio website. It's a privilege to work with authors such as Maria, and my co-hosts Ingrid Rose and Gary Sill, our music man and tech support. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to Writers Radio, a non-commercial collaborative project which presents talented writers reading their own work. These stories, essays, and conversations revisit the long tradition of oral storytelling that connects us to the inspiration behind the words. Be sure to check the website, writersradio.ca, to subscribe to our free notifications list. It's also a way of letting the writers know you are there and appreciating their creative work.
Writers Radio broadcasts from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast in Canada, traditional tribal land of the Sechelt Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. We express our gratitude for their wisdom teachings and land stewardship.